This special joint subcommittee on tax policy to order. This is our first meeting, and it, I think, is going to be very substantive, having looked at some of the briefing papers, as I'm sure many of you have also. We're going to be hearing presentations from Virginia on our tax policy from both the Department of Taxation and from JLARC about their study on individual income tax progressivity. But first, the committee needs a chair and a vice chair. And so do members have nominations for chair?
Madam Chair, I nominate Senator Howell from Fairfax County. So
I'll second that.
Yeah.
Okay. It's been moved and seconded that I be the chair. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
I'm tempted to say no, but I won't. And now we need a vice chair, and I'll recognize Delegate Austin.
Madam Chair, I would like to nominate Chairman Knight as vice chair, please.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded that Chairman Knight be vice chair. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed?
No.
So it's good, Fred.
My job is to make sure you show up at all the meetings.
Okay. Well, we have a series of overviews to inform us on this topic. And actually, I was very embarrassed and surprised to see that in the briefing papers there were a couple of things I didn't know. So, I hope nobody else is in that situation. But first, let's hear from Kristen Collins, Assistant Commissioner of Tax Policy at Tax. Hello, nice to see you. No.
Now can you hear me okay?
Yes,
okay, great,
much
thank
better.
you. It's good to see you all this afternoon. Before I get into our presentation, I just wanted to give a quick staff update. We've had a lot of staffing changes due to retirements within the Department of Taxation. So just wanted to very quickly give you the faces of the people that you'll be dealing with this session. So first of all, we have a new policy director who will actually be starting in 2 weeks, David Sams, if he could stand up for me. And then Joseph Mayer, who you've worked with in the past, is the lead analyst for our sales and local tax team, so he'll continue to work with you this session. And then James Savage is our new lead analyst on the income tax side. So just wanted to, and Joe and James will be presenting with me today as well. So just wanted to share that with you real quick. So if you have any questions, feel free to let any of us know. So I'm going to do a very brief overview of revenue collections and the types of taxes that are administered in Virginia. And then James is going to give an overview of individual and corporate income taxes. And Joe will give an overview of the retail sales and use tax. And then we're happy to answer any questions that you may have about any of these things. So first of all, just to kind of give a quick overview of what statewide revenue collections look like, what funds state government. Approximately a little over a third of collections are general fund taxes that the Department of Taxation collects. A pretty small portion are general fund taxes that other agencies collect, and then almost 2/3 of state revenues are non-general fund revenue sources. And you can see here kind of the comparison over time. As you can see, non-general fund revenue collections have increased pretty significantly. General fund have increased slightly in comparison over the past few years. And here's kind of a comparison of the major revenue sources that the Department of Taxation administers. The three big ones we'll be talking about today are individual income tax, corporate income tax, and sales and use tax. Individual income tax is roughly 2/3 of general fund revenues from the taxes that we administer. Sales and use tax, the general fund portion of that is about 16%, and Joe will talk in a minute about what that sales tax distribution looks like, but a portion of it is general fund. A portion is non-general fund and local that go to other sources, and then about 6% is the corporate income tax, and then roughly 10% are other revenue sources. This is just a list of examples of the taxes administered by our agency. In addition to the income taxes and sales taxes, we administer the insurance premiums license tax, the bank franchise tax, the railroad rolling stock tax, the state tax, which is technically expired, but for some estates that are still being wrapped up from before 2007, we will still administer that. And then the recordation tax that's collected by the clerks of the circuit court, but we also have a role in administering that tax. We also administer a number of non-general fund revenue source taxes. The retail sales and use tax, like I mentioned, a portion of that is non-general fund, but also the communication sales and use tax, the aircraft sales and use tax, watercraft, cigarette and other tobacco product taxes, and then a number of smaller commodity taxes that are dedicated to specific revenue sources. And then there are also a number of taxes administered by other agencies that you can see here that I'm not going to get into too much, but other agencies do administer some of these taxes. So now James Savage is going to give an overview of first individual income tax and then the corporate income tax. So James.
So thank you, Kristen. So Madam Chair, members of the committee, I'm James Savage, lead tax policy analyst from the tax department. And so the individual income tax here. The first thing, so the next slide essentially is about conformity. And so what does this mean? So looking at the first bullet point here, so Virginia generally conforms to federal definitions of income as of a fixed date. So this is helpful for Virginia taxpayers because, when we conform, it means that, line 1 of the Virginia return can be just copied right over to, or can be copied right from the federal return, from a line of the federal return. The issue is that, as many of you know, is that Virginia conformity is as of a fixed date. That means, if Virginia wants to pick up something that changed in federal law from the prior year, the General Assembly must pass legislation to update its date of conformity to sometime on or after the changes made by Congress. Generally, as you know, the General Assembly does this every year. As it says in the second bullet point here, during the 2022 General Assembly session, the date was advanced from December 31st, 2020 to December 31st, 2021. So that's our current date of conformity. And as you can see in this last bullet point, which has several parts to it, there's several reasons why we conform. We got simplicity, so taxpayers do not have to recalculate their tax liability with different Virginia definitions and rules. They can just pull the starting number right off the federal. The department can rely on federal data and compliance measures for accuracy, so there's less conflict, there's less potential for revenue loss. And then Virginia forms and compliance can focus on Virginia additions, Virginia subtractions, Virginia credits, and doesn't have to be concerned about recalculating income. So let's see here. So moving to the next slide here. So even though, oops, I think I went ahead one too many there. So moving to the next slide here. So this is a deconformity provision. So even though Virginia overwhelmingly conforms to federal tax law and picks up most things, there are a few things we deconform from here. A few of them I'd probably mention that are kind of important. So bonus depreciation, that would be the first one there. That's something a lot of states deconform from. Virginia is not that unusual in that regard. It's something that affects mainly business taxpayers. You have the last one there, the last bullet point is certain business tax changes made by the CARES Act and Consolidated Appropriations Act. That one you may remember because that involved the Paycheck Protection Loan Program and how we had slightly different rules for that. There's a few other ones here. I won't go through them all. A lot of them are sort of timing provisions. So basically you still get the deduction. It's just a question of when you get it sooner on the federal return and maybe a little later on the state return. So turning to the next slide here. So the good news this year, so the last few years we've had a few issues with conformity. And this year, it seems like so far, so good, knock on wood. It's sort of been a refreshing change because Congress has not made that many changes to, federal tax law that are really affecting our conformity bill. Right now, as you can see, there's really two changes here. So the first one basically increases the deduction taxpayers can take for making certain energy efficient improvements to commercial property. And again, that's a business deduction. And then the second one allows faster depreciation for certain properties related to clean energy and energy storage. Should mention the Inflation Reduction Act did do a lot of tax stuff, but the good news is almost none of that, except for these two, flow through to the Virginia return. So as you can see here, the fiscal impact is about $250,000 or so a year. So it seems like this, is pretty straightforward, but I will mention that with conformity, Congress, as you may know, I think many of the members of the committee are probably already aware that Congress tends to do stuff like at the end of the year or sometimes early in the next year. And so we're going to be following that closely. And, if there's any updates, we'll let you know. But so far, so good. So turn into the next slide here. Let's see here. So computation of tax. So here, this is kind of a nice slide because it just gives you in one slide basically how everything's computed for the individual income tax. So the starting point is federal adjusted gross income. So that's the line 1 of the Virginia return. It comes right off of line 11 of the federal return. So it's nice and easy that you can just copy that over as long as we pass conformity, that is. And then you add specified items to the extent they're included, or excluded from FAGI. So that second bullet point basically means that there are basically several items that Virginia taxes that the feds do not tax. This is pretty rare. I guess the most common one is that we tax interest income earned on bonds issued by other states, and that's a common thing that states do. But other than that, there aren't too many additions. On the other hand, there are a good amount of subtractions, and so that represents income that we at the state level have chosen to not tax. But it is taxed at the federal level. So a great example of that would be the military retirement subtraction that was just passed this past session. And then going on from there, you can deduct whether or not included in income, federal adjusted gross income, that is, FAGI for short, specified deductions such as the $12,000 age deduction, either the standard or itemized deduction, or personal exemptions. I'm going to talk about these things on the next few slides, so I won't go into them too much here. Then you apply the tax rates. Again, the next slide will be about that. And then you apply any tax credits that can reduce your tax liability. So earned income tax credit might be an example of that. And so the rate structure here, pretty straightforward. As you can see, I'll let the table mostly speak for itself, 2%, 3%, 5, and 5.75% most people hit. And then personal exemptions. So this one basically is a flat amount that everyone gets, essentially tax-free per person on the return. So it's set for state purposes at, as you can see here, $930 currently. So essentially, for example, if you have a married couple with no children, they'll essentially get a personal exemption of $930 each. So $930 and $930, if you add that together, it's $1,860. So it's a per person that's on the return. And that income is essentially tax-free to them is the idea. And it notes in the first bullet point here that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act got rid of the personal exemption at the federal level, but we kept ours at the state level, which several other states have done that too. So let's see here. So the next one is the standard deduction. So kind of a similar idea here. This is a flat amount that is essentially not going to be taxed. You get to just deduct it out of your income. Unlike the personal exemption, you only get the standard deduction if you choose to itemize. And so and the other thing to mention is it's a flat amount per return. And most folks are itemizing because of that first bullet point there. Under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the federal standard deduction was very largely increased, about doubled to $12,000 and then $24,000 for joint filers. And actually, the actual amount's a little higher because there have been some inflation adjustments that have went through. And And so for Virginia purposes, you can see our standard deduction. We've also increased it, or Virginia has. So in 2019 and then most recently in 2022, you can see the current amounts sort of in the right column there. Although I should mention the caveat that's in the star there is these are subject to revenue triggers, but assuming the revenue triggers are met, it'll be $8,000 for single and married filing separately, and then for married filing jointly, it's $16,000. So just to give an example, because all these numbers floating around, so if you have a couple with married couple with no children, they get the $16,000 standard deduction, so $16,000 essentially tax-free, and then they get an additional $930 per person due to the personal exemption. So if you add that together, it's $930 plus $16,000. That gives you what was I say $17,860. So.
This seems like a good stopping point to see if anybody has any
Sure.
questions. No. Okay, keep going.
Oh, thank you. So now turning to the corporate income tax. So this is the income tax that is generally paid by businesses that are set up as corporations. You know, I did want to mention that there are a lot of businesses that are set up as things like LLCs and partnerships, and they typically don't pay corporate income tax. Instead, they pay tax at the owner level as individuals. But for those businesses set up as corporations, which is mainly larger businesses, although there are some that are smaller businesses, they're going to be paying our Virginia corporate income tax. So turning to the next slide here. So this is the computation, which is pretty similar, if you notice, to individual income tax, just with a few different, a few little differences. So with this, just as with the individual income tax, you're pulling a line off of the federal return. So here you're pulling federal taxable income. So that's pulled right off of the form 1120. So you start right there. So again, of course, that always assumes assuming we update conformity and conform, then that is the starting point. Otherwise, adjustments would need to be made. The second step would be you apply any additions, subtractions, deductions that sort of adjust the amount of Virginia taxable income. Then the next step's a little different, and we got a slide on it right after, so I won't go into it. But for individuals, you typically, especially if they're Virginia residents, you tax their worldwide income. You just tax all the income generally, and there are some ways to offset it if people are double taxed. But for corporate income tax, we have to figure out how much income is attributable to Virginia. We can't tax, all 50 states can't tax all income. So we have this method called where we allocate and apportion income, basically determine how much income is attributable to Virginia. Then after you do that, you get to apply Virginia's 6% tax rate to the income subject to Virginia tax. And then again, you get the tax credits that you can reduce your tax liability by. And so the next slide, as I mentioned, we got a slide here on apportionment. So again, this is about essentially, this is, we don't have this as much in the individual side, but on the corporate side, we have to figure out, how much income is attributable to Virginia. And this is constitutionally required, and all states have rules like this. And we do this through what we call an apportionment formula, which is like sort of basically a fraction. And this fraction is determined by three factors. You have property, payroll, and sales. And sales are double weighted, which means we count it twice. So of these factors, this bullet point mentions sales can be the most difficult to determine. And that's particularly true with sales of services and intangibles. We use something called the cost to performance method, and that can be sometimes kind of difficult to compute. So just wanted to mention that. And then in certain situations, Virginia allows alternative methods such as market-based sourcing. So I'll talk about that in a moment on the last slide here, which I'm going to cover, which is recent trends in other states. So we really kind of, there are other trends, but these are sort of the three ones, really big ones we've seen and we've been asked to look at. The first one here is market-based sourcing of services and intangibles. So the idea here with market-based sourcing is to source income where the customer is, rather than where your sort of business is headquartered. That's kind of the idea of it at a very high level. And proponents of market-based sourcing basically say that they think it tends to tax more heavily those businesses headquartered out of state and reduces the tax burden of businesses headquartered in your state. So it's sort of, a lot of states use it as sort of an economic development tool. So far in Virginia, we've not adopted market-based sourcing generally. However, I did want to mention two things. Number one, we have studied it. Prior studies, though, have been unable to figure out the actual revenue impact and the issue essentially is that it potentially has positive revenue impact, but it's based upon out-of-state taxpayers who aren't currently filing with Virginia. So it's kind of like you don't know information you don't know. And then the other point is that Virginia has adopted market-based sourcing for specific industries. So we did for debt buyers in 2018, and then property analytics firms in 2022, very recently, last session. And so then move into the second bullet point here, second big bullet point, single sales factor apportionment. The idea here is kind of similar. So basically what's happening is that the idea of single sales factor is to source solely based upon where your sales are. So not where your property, we're not just going to totally ignore your property, your payroll, just source based upon where your sales are. And again, kind of like market-based sourcing, proponents of single sales factor argue that sort of on similar grounds that this method can tend to increase the tax of those businesses headquartered sort of out of state that don't have much property and payroll in the state, and then sort of decrease the tax paid by businesses headquartered in the state because their property and payroll don't count against them. However, as noted on the slide, Virginia has so far not adopted market-based sourcing generally, but we do have it for specific industries. We have it for manufacturers, and that's elective. We have it for retailers, that's mandatory, and we have it for enterprise data centers, that's mandatory if they enter into a memorandum of understanding, and then debt buyers, that is also mandatory. And then the last bullet point here relates to unitary combined reporting. So this is a little different than the other two. This is more related to mandatory unitary combined reporting is related to requiring most corporations that are like related and that they're affiliated to essentially file one return to report their income and their losses. At a high level, the goal of this method is to prevent income shifting, where essentially one corporation that is taxed kind of shifts that income on over to another corporation that maybe is out of state and not taxed. But as mentioned on the slide, a work group studied this in 2021 and decided that it was not right at this time to move forward with switching to unitary combined reporting. And part of the reason why they said that is that Virginia currently has an intercompany add-back addition, and they thought that was sufficient to prevent any sort of gaming that might go on sort of to shift income. So with that, unless the committee has any questions, I think I'll hand it over to my colleague, Joe Mayer.
Okay, are there any questions or comments? Okay,
Thank
thank you
you.
very much.
Hello. Okay, I'm going to talk about sales tax. As an overview, it's a tax on the sale, lease, or rental of tangible personal property. And let's see, the consumer pays the tax to the merchant who sells them the tax, unless they bought it out of state and didn't pay sales tax, so they pay use tax on it. Recently, the biggest interest in the sales tax has been regarding food. And in the last session, the General Assembly reduced the rate on qualifying food, which is food for home consumption, and it's what meets the federal government's definition for food stamps. And back in 2005, the rate on food for home consumption was reduced to 2.5%, and that was the 1% local option sales tax, and the state rate was limited to 2%. Excuse me, 1.5%. Makes 2.5. Okay, and then in 2019, essential personal hygiene products were added to food in this class of property subject to a lower rate. And a lot of this is feminine hygiene products or incontinence products. And in the last session, it was reduced so that only, effective January 1, only the 1% rate, local rate, will apply to food for home consumption. And there will be payments made to localities to make them whole as to the state, the educational money, the 1% money for education based on K through 12 population. Another interesting thing has been we've had a lot of new local rates in the last 10 years or so. Now, the state rate everywhere is 4.3%, and then there's going to be some additions to that depending on where you are. And in Northern Virginia, and in Hampton Roads, and recently in Central Virginia, there is an additional 0.7% tax that goes for transportation within the transportation district. So that's why in Richmond, Northern Virginia, Hampton Roads, the rate is 6%. And there's also an additional 1% tax in the historic triangle, which is Williamsburg, James City County, and York County. And the funds from that go to regional tourism marketing. So the total rate in those three localities is 7%. And then we have a new sort of additional tax, which is for school construction, and it's a 1% local tax, very similar to the local option tax, and it has to be passed by the locality, by their board of supervisors, their city council, and it has to be ratified by a referendum of the voters. And I'm going to get to a list of those few counties that have that, and so their rate is 6.3%. But in the localities that don't have the 0.7% tax for transportation, the historical triangle tax, or the school construction tax, they're still at 5.3%. Let's see. And before I get to that, I'm going to quickly talk about taxation of online sales, which was always a major missing component of our sales tax revenues. And back in 1992, the Supreme Court had a case named Quill, and it said that a state cannot require a merchant to collect that state sales tax unless that merchant has physical presence in the state, people or property. And that's been the law of the land since then until 2018. And there was the Wayfair case, which changed everything. And it overturned Quill, and it held that physical presence is not required for a state to require a merchant to collect the tax. And the Supreme Court upheld what South Dakota had done where they had put in place a law that said out-of-state merchants need to collect the tax if they have $100,000 in sales into the locality, or they had 200 transactions in the locality. And the Supreme Court said that was okay. And so many states like Virginia have mimicked that. And in 2019, we passed our law, and it also had a marketplace facilitator provision so that companies that might not be the true seller, but they are setting up the sale, like Amazon, because a lot of the items sold on Amazon are not sold by Amazon. You know, they have the, I guess they're just considered the marketplace sellers, and they actually make the sale. Now, most of them are putting their goods in Amazon's warehouses, and they're fulfilled by Amazon. And we've seen a large increase in our collections because of that. And we've got it. I'm not going to go through all of this, but we've got a list of the localities that are in the transportation districts, where they pay the additional 0.7 tax for transportation, and it's got all the Hampton Roads ones, the Northern Virginia ones, and this also has got the three localities that are subject to the historic triangle additional tax. So in those three localities, they actually pay 7%. On top, they pay the 6% that everyone else does down in the Hampton Roads area, but an additional 1% on top of that. And we've got a list of the localities that have the 1% additional tax for school construction. And it's most of these are in the South Side, Virginia, but there's a few others. Charlotte County, City of Danville, Gloucester in the Middle Peninsula, Halifax, Henry, Northampton on the Eastern Shore, and Patrick. And then everyone else is 5.3. And I'm sorry, that was the slide I was talking
And Madam
about.
Chair, Pennsylvania County just passed a referendum on this issue, so you're going to.
And we're just waiting to hear when that'll be effective. And here's a breakdown of where the sales tax money goes in the different areas. And I'm not going to go through all of it, but I think the first table, which talks about all those places in Virginia that still have the 5.3 sales tax, of that 5.3, 2.025 is general fund money, and that there's no hold on that for education or transportation. Then, of course, there's the 1% local option tax. Then there's a total of 1.375 that goes for K through 12 education. And then there's a 0.9% for transportation. And that does not include what is given to transportation in the transportation districts. And then the next chart, we talk about the transportation districts. The only difference is that 0.7% goes for transportation in the district. And this is the last slide. The localities that have the additional 1% tax, they're just like the 5.3, but 1% of that additional 1% goes for local education in that locality, and typically for school construction or renovation. And we have a breakdown of the historic triangle, and it's the same as most of the others we've talked about, except that in addition to the regional transportation, there's also the 1% historic triangle tax. And so that's the conclusion of the presentation, and I'm happy to receive any questions.
Questions? Yes.
The localities, actually pick any one of them, local option 1%. Isn't that correct? That really goes back to localities as education based on the daily membership, does it not? Or?
No, there's two 1% components that go, and really the 1% tax is we consider that the local tax that goes by point of sale. I mean, we do receive all the money for that, but we give it back to the locality. There's a 1% for education by K through 12, and that's part of the, I think we have 1.375, because there's like a quarter and an eighth, and
Right.
those all add up to that.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Any further question? Okay, thank you. Okay. Justin, this is a topic that JLARC has looked at as well, and Justin Brown is going to give us a summary of their recommendations.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair. Nice to see you again. I've been asked to take 15 minutes or so summarizing for you a project, as you said, we completed and briefed to JLARC members back in October, so this will be familiar to those of you that are on JLARC. This study was actually a joint resolution that was introduced by Delegate Watts, I believe, and that was in the 2021 session. So in brief, there was a few key takeaways from this project. First, the changes you made this past session to the income tax will make it more progressive than it was last year. Second, we identified a total of 11 options that you could consider. 7 of these would increase progressivity primarily by lowering taxes on low and middle income filers. The remaining 4 would increase progressivity by raising taxes on high income filers. The options we identified would increase progressivity by a wide range, from just a few percentage points all the way to more than doubling it, up to 115% more progressive. They would also result in revenue changes ranging from 6% less revenue to 6% more revenue. In the interest of time this afternoon, I'm not going to talk about all 11 of these options. I've picked a few to just give you a sense of the types of things we looked at, but be happy to talk to any of you during this meeting or afterwards about all the options we had. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, you just saw this slide from the tax department, so I'm not going to talk about it again, but this is the individual income tax brackets and rates with the filing thresholds there at the bottom. And the specific definition for a tax to be progressive is if the share of income paid in taxes goes up as income goes up. And under that definition, Virginia's income tax is progressive, as are many other states in the federal income tax. So when you talk to proponents of progressive taxation, they emphasize that the reason a tax should be progressive, and in many cases be made more progressive, are the large differentials in income. They argue higher income folks have the ability to pay more in taxes. And so that table there just gives you a sense of how the income averages break down here in Virginia. I'd also say the gap between high-end income folks has been growing in Virginia, nationally and globally. Proponents of tax progressivity will emphasize that this growing gap in income is another reason to make tax systems more progressive. So I just mentioned the definition of tax progressivity, but for our project we needed a way to quantify progressivity and measure how it would change if you did things differently. So we looked at a lot of different ways to measure progressivity, and we settled on the 2 on the slide there. The first we're calling the Progressivity Index, and that focuses equally on all income groups. So this is a gauge of progressivity overall across all filers. The second measure we're calling the High-Low Rate Gap, and that only focuses on the difference between the very high and the low income filers. And this is a measure pretty commonly used by groups focused on tax progressivity. This is just a reference slide if you're so inclined. It shows you the Virginia adjusted gross income, so you can get a sense of what I'm talking about when I explain the impact of our options by the different quintiles of income. So I wanted to just start by reminding you, as was already kind of discussed a few moments ago, there were 2 pretty big changes made this year. First, the standard deduction is increasing pretty substantially, and that will apply to filers irrespective of their income level, but that will help low-income filers quite a bit more. Second, 75% of the earned income credit will now be refundable. And now that it's refundable, it will allow a low-income filer to get a refund, even if they have 0 or very low tax liability. And when we talk to tax experts on this project, they really emphasize the importance of having a credit be refundable if you cared about progressivity. So I want to show you the collective impact of these two options together on each income group in terms of the ways that I just talked about measuring it. The 2021 tax policy is shown in the top gray line, and the new 2022 tax policy is shown just below that in the blue line. And you can see a big reduction in the effective tax rates for the bottom 20% and the second 20%. The bottom 20% gets pushed negative for the first time down to 0.8 down to a negative 1.2, and that essentially turns it into a subsidy program for low-income filers. And just showing the change based on our two progressivity measures, you can see the progressivity index goes up 45%, which is a pretty big increase. And that high-low rate gap also goes up 48%, and that's a big increase because of that large reduction in what the bottom 20% are going to be paying. So in recent years, Virginia's tax has been less progressive than the average state income tax. Now that characterization that we even provided last year at a status update that we gave to our commission, that was based on 2018 data, which is the latest available data set. I'm showing that here in the blue line. But we reran the analysis and inserted the new 22 data. Oh, it's not picking up. Sorry about that. 2022 data, and you can see the gray line there, it drops on the low end. So Virginia is now going to have a more progressive tax than the average other state tax after these changes. So I will just go through some of our options now. They're in order from those that reduce the tax burden on low income, then middle income filers, and then I have a few that would increase the burden on high income filers. So the first option we have is that you could make 100% rather than the now current 75% of the credit refundable. Doing that would push the effective tax rate, again on average, of the bottom 20% of filers down to minus 1.7%. This really only deals with low-income filers in that bottom 20%. This is a pretty sizable reduction in percentage terms, and that would translate into a few $100s more back to each low-income person who files. Now, a few key points on the progressivity changes here. That progressivity index, and again, that's that overall one, that doesn't really move much because this only affects the bottom 20%. That high-low rate gap goes up by more. And what I'm trying to do here, the automation isn't working, but on the bottom lines there, show you compared across all our options how these compare. So the most progressive option we have would increase progressivity by 115% on the progressivity index, and you can see it would go up by 27% for the high-low rate gap. Now, because the bottom filers, the filers in the bottom 20% represent a pretty small share of tax revenue, this would reduce revenue by about 0.2%. And that's about $30 to $40 million. So you could think of this as a fairly cost-effective option in terms of bang for the buck for progressivity. And I did, before I move on, just briefly want to emphasize that we looked into kind of the foundational idea behind giving low-income tax credits. It was really to compensate for higher housing costs, higher food costs, higher energy costs. And so if you wanted to, you could make this even higher. There are some states that have pushed it down to negative 2% or even negative 3%. But this would be a vehicle to do even more there in terms of housing and food costs if you were so inclined. So to set up the next option, as some or all of you may know, the state has had the same income bracket since 1990. And for a year or two, that's not really a big issue. But over the long term, it has a big impact. Incomes go up over time, but the brackets haven't. And one way to quantify this is how much of the median filer's income is being taxed at that $17,000 bracket. And you can see from that little table there, in 1990, none of that median income was taxed at the highest bracket and rate, but by last year, 47% of it was. Experts call this bracket creep, and given where Virginia was in 1990, it's really affected lower, middle, and middle-income households more than others. This is showing you the same thing, just in a different way. Since 1990, the median tax has increased 173%, but the median income has only increased 108%. And the difference between those two things is kind of a quantification of that bracket creep dynamic. So one option would be to adjust the income brackets based on inflation since 1990. Here's what that would do to the effective tax rates. You can see the comparison of the baseline to the option there. You can see all rates go down to some degree, but especially lower, middle, and middle income filers. The progressivity index would go up 23%. The high-low rate gap doesn't move much because the high and the low kind of drop together. But as you can see on the bottom right-hand corner there, because it's been 32 years since brackets have changed, this one-time update would have a pretty big revenue impact. You're basically correcting for 31, 32 years of inflation. So that could reduce state revenue by about 6%, and that ends up being about $1 billion. Now, you could do more than just update the brackets. You could also change the rates. So we have options in the report, and I'll just highlight one here, based on widening the span between the lowest and highest rate to result in a more progressive system. One way to do that could be to update the brackets based on inflation, like I just talked about, but then also drop the lowest rate down to 1% and increase the highest rate to 6.5%. We came up with 6.5% because that's the median top rate across states. And you could do something slightly different with that if you wanted to. But in terms of the impact of how that might look, you'll see that all filers except the very high income folks pay less. And because that top rate increases, higher income filers pay more. Now here you start to see a pretty big increase in progressivity overall and in that high-low rate gap. And what's interesting is, in contrast with what I just showed you about just indexing the brackets, this option would reduce revenue by only about 2%. And that's because you're collecting more revenue from people at the higher end of the scale as you're giving some relief on the lower end, adjusting the brackets for inflation. So we have a number of other options related to increasing rates just on the higher end of the income scale. And before I jump into those options, just give you a little bit of context about top rates. I mentioned earlier that Virginia's 5.75% rate was a little less than the average of 6.5% rate across states. And to give you some perspective of what the really high end looks like, the sub-bullets there show you the nation's highest. These would include California, New Jersey, and New York. A little closer to home, here's the top rates and brackets in the states surrounding Virginia. There's no particular pattern here on both the rates and the income at which they kick in, but there's some pretty big differences. You can see D.C. is much, much higher than Virginia's. North Carolina has a flat tax, which it just reduced to a 4.99% rate for all income levels. One option we have in the report is for you to add a new bracket that would take effect for all income at the level of the top 1% of Virginia income. That was about $598,000, so we just rounded it to $600,000 to keep it simple. You could tax all income above that level at 7% rather than the current 5.75%. That would obviously affect only those in the top 1%, and you can see a 15% increase in the overall progressivity index and an 11% increase in the high-low rate gap. This change could end up raising about 2% more in state revenue compared to the baseline. The next option here is the same idea, just with a higher 9% rate. That would still be below Washington, D.C., but that rate would be higher than Maryland's, although Maryland's kicks in at a much lower income level of $250,000. Again, this only affects the high-income filers. And you start to see a big increase on both measures of progressivity under this one. And the rate increase is high enough that it could bring in about 6% more in state revenue, and that would be about $1 billion in additional revenue. So I will wrap up with one final section, Madam Chair. And I made this point earlier, but I just want to circle back on it again in a slightly different way. The effect of not adjusting for inflation essentially just results in a steady tax increase each year. And this just shows you kind of year by year over the last 30 years plus of how much of median Virginia income was being taxed at that highest rate. And you can see a slow, steady increase in what's being taxed, again, because the income goes up and the brackets don't. It's just a few percentage points each year, but the longer you wait to do it, the bigger that problem becomes. So Virginia could start adjusting its income brackets for inflation just moving forward, and this is it would join a lot of other governments that do this. It's also fairly progressive because it doesn't unintentionally raise taxes on lower and middle income filers year over year. It's something the federal government does. There are 24 other states with income taxes who do this, and again, it's a way to mitigate that slow, steady tax increase each year over time. So this just sets that off as a separate option. I would say that in contrast with the $1 billion cost of updating since 1990 that I mentioned, if you did this moving forward just on the brackets, it'd be about a $10 million change in that first year, reduction in that first year. So I will wrap up with something you probably cannot read. This is all 11 options in the report. They are sorted by their rating on the progressivity index. You can see if you wanted to come up with some revenue neutral or close to revenue neutral packages, you could start to look at that change in state revenue and pick some that increase, or one that increases and one that decreases. But there's 4 or 5 in here, just in the interest of time, that I didn't bring up, but they're in the written report that's on our website. So that's all I had, Madam Chair. I'd be happy to take questions.
Are there questions for Justin? Yes, Senator Norman.
My first question, I don't even know how to phrase it. I'm looking at slide 20. Why in the world does Virginia want to, no, I take it back, 19. Why does Virginia want to lump itself in as being characterized as progressive with California, Hawaii, New York, and New Jersey?
Well, I can't really speak for the Commonwealth collectively. We were asked to look at ways to increase progressivity, and one of the ways to do that is to increase top rates, and we wanted to show you the rates of the highest in the nation.
Well, of course, Madam Chairman, if we got up to 11% with Hawaii, Senator Saslaw could just stay home rather than go to Honolulu. Madam Chairman, just for my English history background edification, remind me that under the Earned Income Tax Credit, which an option is to increase that, we would be giving a check to people who do not even have a tax liability. Is that right?
The way that refundable credits work, and they're designed to work this way, is if you have no income or are below the threshold, you get a subsidy back through the individual income tax. That's correct.
Madam Chairman, why is that not creating a new social program?
Well, I think when you talk to tax experts, they do call it a tax subsidy. I think there are some groups that would consider that in addition to other programs, for example, the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program or the SNAP program. But it is part of the tax code, and it is provided through, you have to file to get it. But I think some people, to your point, would characterize it as a social program.
Madam Chairman, no more argumentative questions.
Yeah, I was going to say. It's so unlike you, Senator. Yes, Senator, excuse me, Chairman Knight.
I'm happy where I am, thank you.
Sure you are.
Kind of follow up on a little bit what the Senator said. You said it's kind of been like 32 years since we've had much tax change on progressivity. But when we did the Earned Income Tax Credit, and then we raised the standard deduction, that actually helped the people in the lowest income tax brackets. And as far as progressivity, I can't pronounce that word, goes, that is a big deal right in there. So I didn't know if in your matrices and everything, if you showed that, the total quantification of what we did on that this year.
We did, and you're completely correct that those two things together really made a huge increase in progressivity. 45% on the overall measure and 48% on the high-low rate gap measure. So those two changes absolutely did a lot on progressivity. The only point I was making about the longer you don't adjust your brackets, it, particularly for the low and middle income filers, it cuts into their income a little bit more. But as you said, the two things that were done were big increases in progressivity. You're exactly right.
Actually, between the time when we put in the budget that we would have this joint subcommittee and now, we actually did face a very urgent situation that was totally unfair. I think virtually everybody thought that our tax system was unfair, and that's why we made the changes in the budget that have made the changes that you have referenced. But there is still, I think, on the table the discussion of whether we want to go further or not. But it's without question, jointly, we made a huge
Absolutely.
improvement.
Big improvement,
in what
absolutely.
we were doing. In what we were doing. Okay, yes, Delegate Watts.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Following up on that bit of history, and when I introduced the resolution for JLARC to study progressivity, this was also before. So one of the first things that I liked when I saw this was that what we did was substantial, increasing our progressivity. There's still tremendous value in having all 11 options costed out as well as measured as far as low, high, and the, what index?
Well, we call it the overall progressivity index.
That this is extremely valuable, and I would love to have that index on every fiscal impact statement for tax legislation going forward, so that we are aware when we're doing it. I'm going to be facetious and say we got lucky when we did the refundable and the standard deduction, but it would be nice to have those measures on every fiscal impact statement going forward on what we're doing. Having that really was all more a matter of preface. Am I not accurate that the earned income tax credit doesn't go to all low income, but has very specific family size and income gradients that the federal government established or updates every year, and it has established for decades?
There are quite a few it's based off the federal, and there are quite a few rules on the federal. I would defer to the tax department on that, but that's correct. There are parameters on it. Again, you do have to file to get it.
And essentially, it is all towards family. Earned income tax credit is geared more towards, there's very few single that would qualify that are really that low.
I think that's right, yes.
May I have another one?
Yes.
Although I know.
I told her she got two.
Oh, we set a limit.
I praised you on the first one, so.
You get another one.
The next one is, and wouldn't you know that of the options that you picked, I'm going to come up with one that I'm sorry that you didn't present. But I do compliment you, and this is very, very serious. I compliment you, and I wish that tax would do it always. And that is that small note, I think it was on slide 7, that says that we have a zero bracket, that you aren't taxing somebody at $3,000. It is the taxable income comes after the zero bracket of essentially $12,000 for single, $24,000 for merit. And that makes a whole difference on the public's perception of what we're doing. And it's an important, that shouldn't be just a little footnote. And in fact, every time we show the brackets, every time we show this, we should be showing that it's not at that point, but that we start at a zero bracket. And I understand there was real concern in this study that we look at the efficiencies of our tax collection, et cetera. Well, definitely, the zero tax bracket is a very important part of our efficiency, because we don't go after little nickel and dime, very small income. And this is one thing that I wanted to be sure and bring forward, in part because it hasn't been adjusted either. It started, I think, about in 2007 and was phased in for about 4 years, but it hasn't been adjusted since 2012. So it too, like everything, needs to have the same kind of constant upping of the, just as the feds do, so that we're picking it all up. And I particularly would emphasize that when you look at that option in your report, it's really hitting the low and very low moderate income as an important part of where the progressivity occurs. And later I'll have a fourth question, if only if recognized. I do have one other.
Well, I don't see other, oh, I do see another hand, okay. Well.
So my last
Hand it
question,
off.
thank you, Madam Chair. My first question was more of clarification, so I wouldn't think that should count toward my 2.
I'm not limiting questions.
So I'd like to commend you on the study. I've actually carried the bill for, I think, at least 2 or 3 years to index our brackets. I think we made the right decision as a body to change the standard deduction instead of indexing the brackets. I'd like to see us go forward and look at changing that standard deduction again. I think that I could go into a fairly lengthy explanation of why I think that's better than indexing the brackets, but again, it's up to discussion, of course. But the other thing I would say is when we increase that standard deduction, we have solved what Delegate Watts is referring to as that zero bracket. And personally, I don't like the zero bracket. I think we should be dealing with it from the standard deduction approach. The problem I have with the zero bracket is we've created a situation where you go just above that zero bracket and you go back in your tax from $0. So you don't have a smooth change in tax liability, which I think a good system would have. So if we looked at trying to, again, we have to look at revenues and what we believe are sustainable ongoing revenues, but if we look at ongoing sustainable revenues, we really care about increasing the progressivity of our tax code, then we can look at what can we do from a standard deduction. If we really want to look at simplifying our tax code, there is no better way to simplify the tax code than increasing our standard deduction. And from a compliance standpoint, it makes it simpler as well. And if you want to combine that with some sort of, I don't really call it a social program, but if you want to combine that with looking at something from an earned income tax credit type of refundability standpoint, I think there's areas where we can look at and we can come to an agreement as bodies. But I think we could address the zero bracket if we got our standard deduction a little higher. So then you want to simplify your bracket, you bump your standard deduction, you get rid of the personal exemptions as an example. There's really no logical reason to have a personal exemption. It works exactly as the standard deduction would work. So I just kind of throw those ideas out. One other thing, since if I combine it, then I only used one question and I'll be done. But during the enabling legislation, it talked about, specifically, it says, giving consideration to fairness, certainty, convenience of payment, economy of collection, simplicity, neutrality, as being goals of this tax policy committee. And I think there's several suggestions I might offer that would be very big steps in that regard that we ought to, I don't know that it needs to be legislative, all of these need to be legislative answers, because we don't want to put out legislation. We don't know if it's good or not, but it's something that the tax department could look at and say, hey, this is a really good idea. Let's get some legislation rolling for it next year. The obvious one at the top of the list is conformity, but we need legislation. We've worked through it back and forth, and we'll continue to work forward from that. So I'm not going to touch base on that. But the simplified sales tax reporting, which about half the states do. You have I think you have 8 states that have no tax. So that leaves 42 in the District of Columbia, and about 24 or 27 of them use simplified sales tax reporting. So we put Wayfair in place. We say, business corporations, you need to figure out how to do all these things. Well, different states look at what's considered tangible property slightly differently. And so a number of states have gotten together and have all agreed to this standard. And it's a standard we should be looking to see if it makes sense in Virginia. Again, it's not something that costs us money. It might increase our revenue, it might decrease our revenue, but it certainly makes compliance much easier, and it should make it easier for our tax department going forward. The other I would bring up is we did some fairly significant changes in transient occupancy tax with the collections of the intermediate or the VRBOs and Expedias of the world a couple years ago. We did not, at the same time, similarly create an option or a system where they can remit those payments in an easier fashion. So if there's, I don't know how many localities there are in Virginia, but even all localities might have a slightly different tax rate. That's fine, but there should be some central repository so that every one of these intermediaries is not doesn't have to go through sending a check every month to Campbell County theirs is due on the 20th, but Loudoun County's due on the 10th. this county collects every 3 months instead of every 1 month. Again, these are things that I think when we look at this committee and how can we simplify the tax collection policy, there are just some ideas I think we ought to look at. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I believe Delegate Watt, back to you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. And this one for me is a biggie. When COVID hit, I began almost immediately, because of where I was at the time, to really look at what our options would be should we need additional revenue, and making sure that it was the right options for Virginia's structure as opposed to just theory. And one of the big surprises that I ran into is that I always knew we had a spread in cost of living, but we have the second highest in the nation. And the reason why I bring that up is that any time that we start looking at adjusting brackets, we have to understand that the latest figures that I have is that it's 150% in most of the jurisdictions in Northern Virginia, as opposed to 100 for most of the rest of the state. So anytime you're talking about basic living, and where those brackets should be for someone so that you're not taxing overly what they need for basic living, that first bracket has to almost go, that first quintile has to almost go up to 25,000. The second quintile up to 50,000. The third quintile up to 100,000. And that is very, very significant in how it's hurting a lot of, I mean, I know it looks like Northern Virginia is doing just fine, but I've operated for a long time on a man drowned in a stream whose average depth was 4 feet. We have a lot of folks on free and reduced lunch, and a lot of people who are living very basically. So I have real problems with that idea that our brackets can just move up without recognizing that cost of living factor of basic living of what we should be taxing, and wanted to make sure that that was also part of our dialogue. I will say that I have no problem at the 1%, because there I'm not talking about basic living if we're talking about over 600,000. But I have a lot of problem that we haven't solved either through our local composite index or a lot of other issues. We have not addressed that basic question. Even though you've let me hold forth one perspective to what Delegate McNamara was saying about the zero bracket versus standard deduction. It's almost 6 to 1 has done progressively. I absolutely champion standard deduction. You go for it, definitely we go up. But it is interesting that as I parse it, and here I would love to have, if I'm wrong, that the zero bracket, if I don't know the percentage of filers who are in fact business filers who get a lot of deductions. And so they're not going to use the standard deduction. But as we saw with the tax reform coming through the federal government in 2018, there were a lot of people who were at zero taxes who benefited because they were businesses. They have a lot of income that they can put into businesses. So if we went standard deduction, they would benefit. Which is an interesting difference, because if you went with zero bracket and moved it up, you'd help the businesses who've already taken a lot of individual deductions and don't go standard deduction. So this is also all part of this complexity. Am I wrong about the fact that they still get a lot of business? We don't get our employee business deductions, but I assume all the small businesses still get theirs.
Well, I'd probably get myself in trouble if I tried to answer that without the tax department weighing in. But there's this VK1 where, for example, an LLC will distribute income, and then if you get a VK1, you file that income on your personal returns, I'm sure you know. And so that's taxed at the exact same way investment income and wage income and income from... So, in terms of the specific question, I don't know the answer to that. Maybe, I don't want to put you on the spot, but what would you say about that?
I will try. Hi, Delegate Watts. So I think if what you're asking, are you asking if a business that's not profitable and has losses, so therefore they don't have to file, if they would benefit, which is one category, or you could also have a business that is profitable but just has a lot of business deductions that they can claim, and they would still need to file because they'd be above the filing threshold, so they would still benefit. Is that, if it's a, pass through?
It's just that as all taxpayers, if you move up the zero bracket, are you not moving up everybody's? We don't start our 1% or 2% until we get over the zero bracket. So it moves everybody up, and I'm saying it particularly helps the business that has had a lot of deductions, as opposed to they wouldn't benefit if we increase the standard deduction.
Yeah, so if they have profits, but they just have deductions, they would still have to file because the zero
understand
bracket,
that.
okay, gotcha. But yeah, you're correct. If they had losses and they were caught up in that, they wouldn't, benefit from it, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank everyone who was presenting. Delegate McNamara and Delegate Watts have outlined a number of issues that we'll be looking at in the future, unless we can solve them during this session. No, seriously, thank you for outlining all these various issues. I am quite positive we will not be meeting during the session, but we will again after the session is over. And I want to thank everyone for participating. And we may stand and rise.